What's happening, UFC fans? Ryan Thomas here, live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. UFC 280 post-fight reaction show. UFC 280 just finished up a couple hours ago. I was very happy that UFC 280 was available during the day. This fight taking place in Abu Dhabi. So we knew that this one was going to be during the day as far as the pay-per-view. And that's my one biggest pet peeve in regards to the UFC, is that on the East Coast, if you're an East Coast mixed martial arts fan, you're tuning into these fights and it is late. The main card starts at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, where this card, being that it was in Abu Dhabi, was at 2 o'clock. 8-hour time difference, of course, across Yas Island. So in this podcast, I will dive into anything and everything UFC 280 involving Sean O'Malley's split decision victory versus Petr Yan, Aljamain Sterling defending his title against former two-time UFC bantamweight champion TJ Dillashaw, as well, last and certainly not least, Islam Makhachev and new UFC lightweight champion. And let's start off with Sugar Sean O'Malley. I talked about this on my YouTube channel in regards to Sean O'Malley's big performance. This was his big moment. With an impressive victory over Petr Yan, we would see Sean O'Malley get catapulted into, superstar status. The superstardom would be right at his front door, which he's been waiting for that opportunity to be that superstar. He's getting it with this fight against Petr Yan with a decisive win. But this was a very hotly contested decision by mixed martial arts fans, whether they're on Twitter, whether they're on Instagram, you name it. That was a fight that I felt like was a case of a robbery. Shall I say, a case could be made that it was a robbery. You land 6 takedowns if you're Petr Yan, then you should feel pretty good about your chances and your opportunity of winning that fight if you land 6 takedowns in the fight. In 15 minutes, six takedowns in 15 minutes, it's pretty damn good. And two judges had this one, 29-28 for Sugar Sean O'Malley, winning this one in the first round and in the third round. And one judge had it with Yan winning the fight in the first and third round. Split decision, 29-28 for Sean O'Malley. And listen, I think Sean O'Malley did prove that he belongs in the top 10 of that division, 100%. Quite possibly, I think he proved that he belongs in the top 5 of that division. But to say he won that fight, I think we'd be fooling ourselves, saying that Sean O'Malley won that fight in convincing fashion, convincing enough for 2 out of 3 judges to say that he won the fight. Really, the only opportunity that O'Malley had success was on the feet. I thought Petr Yan did a really good job of avoiding a lot of the punches, but that third round for Sean O'Malley, he did turn it up. He landed a beautiful knee, and I feel the knee in that third round won him that round. It opened up Petr Yan, and rather than going too deep into, whether I thought O'Malley won the fight, I don't think he won the fight. I thought Yan won the fight. We can only deal with what we're given. And these 2 judges out of 3 believed that Sean O'Malley won the fight. So if they believe that he won the fight, we have to talk about what's potentially next on this show for Sean O'Malley. Potentially what could be next for Sugar Sean O'Malley is Aljamain Sterling, who is the UFC bantamweight champion. Just based upon the status of the UFC and what they like to do as far as making matchups, Sean O'Malley, to me, is that guy that, Dana White and the powers that be, the big, head honchos, the UFC brass, they want to build up Sean O'Malley. There's no mistake about it, no doubt about it. And Sean O'Malley winning this fight, albeit in a hotly contested decision, is good for the UFC. It's good for Sean O'Malley, of course. But I think putting O'Malley, based off of what we saw in this fight against Petr Yan, I feel Aljamain Sterling, and based on what we saw from Aljamain Sterling, I'll talk about that, of course, in this podcast. Based off of what we saw from Sean O'Malley, I don't think we could convince ourselves that O'Malley can get past Aljamain Sterling. I think Aljamain Sterling is on another level in comparison to Sean O'Malley. Now, would that be an entertaining fight? Would that be a fight that, the masses would tune into 100%? But is it the next right fight for Sean O'Malley? I don't think so. And when I look at, Sean O'Malley, and when I look at the top 5 of the UFC bantamweight division, he definitely belongs in that mix now that he did get that win on Petr Yan on the record, right? On the record. It is on the record as a green victory rather than a red defeat, right? So, when looking at the athletes that are in the UFC bantamweight division, no doubt about it, Petr Yan just beat the number 1 ranked bantamweight. So you could say that, Sean O'Malley just beat the number 1 ranked bantamweight in Petr Yan. Could we see a fight between Merab Dvalishvili versus Sean O'Malley? Could we see a fight between Corey Sandhagen and Sean O'Malley? That's one that I would love to watch. Because what I do feel is not only is Sean O'Malley not ready for Aljamain Sterling, I feel like there's other guys out there for Aljamain Sterling to fight. So while I will call this one a robbery in terms of how the judges decided this fight, maybe Yan and O'Malley can do it over again. Maybe O'Malley fights a Corey Sandhagen, and we move on to what I think could potentially be next for Aljamain Sterling. So yes, was this a robbery? 100%. It was one of the worst, decisions I think I've seen in quite some time. But we got to deal with the reality of it that bad decision, good fight, great fight, but a bad decision to say the least. So moving on, what is next for Aljamain Sterling? I'll talk about that in this next portion of the podcast. Aljamain Sterling defends his UFC bantamweight title against former 2-time UFC bantamweight champion TJ Dillashaw, and he did it in very impressive fashion. Was it exciting? That's another question for another day. But was it dominant? You know it. Aljamain Sterling is a very tricky fighter to game plan for. He's a very tricky fighter to grapple with. He's somebody that you'd never want to wrestle with on that mat inside the octagon. And TJ Dillashaw found himself in a very vulnerable position almost as soon as the fight started, firing off a head kick. That's the last technique that I would want to throw, a technique that is catchable while these guys are extremely dry early in a fight. They're not wet, they're not soaking wet with sweat. TJ Dillashaw going in dry, Sterling going in dry. It's not the technique you'd want to throw early in that fight, but TJ Dillashaw threw it, and he found himself in a very precarious position. In full mount, mounted. Sterling was just such a wizard in terms of the grappling department in this fight, and I truly feel that it showcased the exact reason why Aljamain Sterling shouldn't be overlooked any longer. Aljamain Sterling's a great fighter. He's got a lot of tools in his tool belt, in his toolkit, whatever you want to say. Aljamain Sterling's a tough out for anyone in the UFC 135-pound weight class, and I do believe Aljamain Sterling has a great opportunity ahead of him to take on a fighter that has no need to be introduced, but former UFC bantamweight, former UFC flyweight champion Henry Cejudo. That's what I'd like to see next for Aljamain Sterling. And yes, Henry Cejudo, he can waltz right back into the sport and get a title shot. He never lost his titles. He gave away his titles when he retired. Wanted to start a family, wanted to live his own life for a little bit, wanted to do his own thing, and got the chance to do so, and now he is back in the USADA testing pool, and he wants to get back into the octagon and have a fun fight. And I think that's the fight that makes sense. There's no number 1 contender fight for Henry Cejudo that really makes a lot of sense. You don't put Henry Cejudo in a contender fight. Henry Cejudo is one of the bigger names at 135 pounds and below. So Sterling defending against Dillashaw. Dillashaw did suffer a shoulder injury in this fight, so I do believe that TJ Dillashaw will be out for quite some time. Once again, the body is starting to fail TJ Dillashaw. You can come up with any reason why that might be. You could say maybe it's because of, the steroids, EPO. Maybe the body's starting to break down from not using those things. I just think it's a combination of a lot of things. Possibly that, but as well, TJ Dillashaw is getting older, and the inactivity from that suspension is not good for your future, your career. You don't get those years back. So, unfortunately, TJ Dillashaw coming out with the loss on this one for him, but I do expect him back in the octagon at some point. I don't think he's done. I think he's got a lot of fight left. It's just a matter of who do you put him up against after a loss like that. So those are my thoughts on Aljamain Sterling and his performance against TJ Dillashaw. Great win for Sterling to put on the resume, and I very much look forward to seeing what's next for him. I do believe it should be, and quite possibly will be, Henry Cejudo. So, guys, Ryan Thomas here, UFC 280 post-fight reaction show. Folks, you can follow me on Twitter at Ryan Thomas Take, as well as Instagram. And you can also like the show on YouTube and Facebook. Subscribe on YouTube, of course, to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. And like the Thomas Take Sports Podcast on Facebook. Greatly appreciate the support that I've had over the last few years recording and broadcasting this show. I have a ton of awesome guests that will be coming on over the course of this football season as well. Former fighters, trainers, you name it. So stay tuned for more. Right here, right now, on the UFC 280 post-fight reaction show, it is time to discuss the breaking news and new UFC lightweight champion Islam Makhachev. And new UFC lightweight champion, he puts himself in the same company as the man that was largely responsible for getting him into the sport. And it's not Khabib Nurmagomedov, it's Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov. Rest in peace to the father of Khabib Nurmagomedov, whose vision was not only that his son would become the champion of the UFC's lightweight division, but that his son's best friend, Islam Makhachev, would become the UFC lightweight champion. Abdulmanap's vision became reality. And I wanted to touch on that to start this segment of the show. Islam Makhachev fought a flawless performance against former UFC lightweight champion Charles "Do Bronx" Oliveira, who had a great run as the champion of the 155-pound weight division in the UFC, of course. Charles Oliveira, much respect to him and his championship run that he had. Coming to an end today, though. Islam Makhachev taking away the title from Charles "Do Bronx" Oliveira, and Islam Makhachev has strikingly, pun intended, great striking. His boxing is superb. I think Islam Makhachev's hands are far better than Khabib, and Khabib had good hands, but Islam Makhachev has great hands, great boxing, and also has, of course, the ability to grapple among the best in the world. So, there were a lot of reasons to believe that Charles Oliveira would get this done, because Charles Oliveira has consistently defied expectation by beating guys like Justin Gaethje, by beating guys like Michael Chandler, by beating guys like Dustin Poirier, not just beating them, but finishing them. And why would Islam be any different? Well, he proved why he's different. Islam Makhachev, I believe, and this is a hot take of the show, I believe Islam Makhachev will be the champion of the UFC lightweight division for quite some time. I think we are now in another era, maybe a Khabib 2.0 era, where Islam Makhachev is going to do what Khabib did for the most part. He's going to be his own fighter. He's going to fight his own fights. He's going to finish the fights his own way. But what made Khabib great, I believe, was his mentality. And I think Islam Makhachev has a very similar championship mindset to be willing to grind consistently over and over and over again, fight after fight after fight. And make no mistake about it, I missed this portion of the pay-per-view, the fact that Islam Makhachev has a mega fight waiting for him in his first title defense, where UFC featherweight champion Alexander Volkanovski could take on Islam Makhachev in their next fight in Perth, Australia. That's big business. That's a big deal for the UFC. That's a big deal for Islam. It's a big deal for Alex. And that's a fight that I really hope we get to see. Because stylistically, styles make fights in mixed martial arts. Stylistically, Can Islam do to Volkanovski what he has done to everyone else? Can Volkanovski do to Islam what Volkanovski has done to everyone else? That is the question with a fight featuring Islam Makhachev and Alexander Volkanovski. Volkanovski has a facet to his game that I think is an advantage. You can call out the short guys all you want. The short guys have something called a low center of gravity. And that low center of gravity means it's harder for you to take them down as they're already low to the ground. You'd think the opposite. Well, if they're lower to the ground, they're easier to... No, the hips are quicker. The speed is there for Alexander Volkanovski, and the wide dexterity that Alexander Volkanovski has in his takedown defense, something we've seen in the fights with Max Holloway, and it's something we've seen all throughout Volkanovski's career as he's fought most opponents far bigger than him. So I can't wait for that fight, and I think that that's an awesome, awesome fight for the UFC to make, and I think that's the next one that we see is Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski. Folks, I'm Ryan Thomas. Thank you so much for tuning into my UFC 280 post-fight reaction show. As I mentioned in the show, follow along on Facebook, follow along on YouTube by subscribing, liking on Facebook, subscribing on any and all audio podcasting platforms, and keep punching.